Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. Can I just put out a little apology in advance here? I have seagulls on my chimney stack, so if you can hear seagulls in the background, it's just my neighbourhood seagulls, so apologies for that. Can I, before we move on to session 3, first of all, extend warm thanks to our masterclass presenters, John Wilson, Mark Frost, Angela McCabe, Paula Nielsen, Fiona Kippax, Gay Cleary and Michael Williamson. Thank you very much for that. I know that the sessions were very warmly received. I have to say I'm very much looking forward to this particular session, which is focusing on innovation in education with particularly shining a light on remote and blended learning. Today, for this session, we are welcoming Joan Mackay, who is Head of Curriculum Innovation at Education Scotland. We also have the pleasure of Paul Downey's company. He is Teacher and Science Faculty Head at Hindland Secondary and also West OS Coordinator. And also Professor Keith Topping, who is a Professor of Educational and Social Research at the University of Dundee. I've done some brief introductions there. All three will be speaking and will obviously have the opportunity to introduce themselves more fully. And after that, we will then go to an expert panel discussion. So if we can first go to Joan, would you like to introduce yourself further?
Thank you, Tracy, and welcome to everybody to the afternoon session. I'm Joan Mackay. I work in Education Scotland, and I work with a small team of people who look and promote curriculum innovation. And because of that, we were very heavily involved, and still are, over this past year with the National e-Learning Offer in particular. And to make connections for participants, those of you who were here in the morning would have heard from Stephen Graham, Digital Deputy in eSchool. And just after I speak, there'll be Paul Downey, who has done all the work, a huge pile of work in West OS, another part of the National e-Learning Offer. And I feel like these two people, I've been talking to them every day for the past 10 months, maybe. So we're an extended team, that's we regard it, and so I hope you'll hear a continuous or a join the dots story between the three of us here. So first slide for me, please. And on to the next one, please, Inka. So just a pause on this particular title on the question mark. This has already been well made, this point, throughout the course of the morning, but the important thing here for all of us, I suppose, as I take you through this reflection piece, is that word pedagogy, summary of learning and teaching as it is experienced by children, young people, learners in general. That's the important bit, and what digital does now is very exciting. It enables us to do that job of teaching and learning better. So the important word is pedagogies, the digital word is the enabler. So what I'm going to do is take you through, first of all, an overview of some of the things we learned with the National e-Learning Offer, what it was, what we were asked to do, and then a little bit of reflection about where we all are now as we kind of hopefully draw breath before there is another eruption of any form of the pandemic. We all think we have little time to think just now. So I was wanting to take you on, not quite a virtual tour, but come with me on a journey and imagine some of the things we learned over the past year, and we want to add that to the general learning that's going on globally and across Scotland from what's been learned in schools and what we've already heard today. So the National e-Learning Offer, as many people will know, and is a combination of three factors. You heard that from Stephen Graham in the morning. There's a live element which is organised through eSchool, and important just to comment on that eSchool was the one the authority concerned had made it possible from very early on, 2016, for GLOW to be used alongside a video capability, and initially started off with VSEAM. So it's important to note that, and therefore they were able to offer nationally before they were requested to do something in the National e-Learning Offer. Then there's the recorded element, and Paul will take his time doing a lot of filling in and discussion around what West to West did. That each piece began, if you want, for the National E-Learning Offer as a result of the learning that took place in the first lockdown, in what we call the Term 4 lockdown. So Paul will take you through that. And then the supported today, just again to explain, during that first lockdown, Education Scotland hosted a series of webinars with curriculum area and subject specialists, and requests came from practitioners to say, look, we're all sharing this anyway across schools and across authorities, whether it was PowerPoints or video clips they had developed themselves, or in links that they had to particular resources such as BBC and so on. And they asked at that point that Education Scotland act as a coordinator to curate all that in one place, which some people find very useful and other people already have their own links. So that's what the supported is. It's a combination of different bits of material. And where we are now, just before I move on to the next slide, is that we are beginning to interplay each of these things really effectively, and that's the innovative bit, and it's really exciting. So on to the next slide, please. Now, I'm going to focus quite heavily in what I say on what came out of eSchool, partly because it had to begin providing very early on, from August onwards of last year. And as I said, Paul will fill in more of the detail on the West to West part of it and in the recorded. So an oversight here, just 3 to 18, there was an ask of eSchool in August that it produce a 3 to 18 curriculum online to be ready as a standby to support schools if and when that was needed. And remember, back in August, none of us knew what were we talking about. Were we talking about teachers being ill in mass numbers? Were we talking about school closures in mass numbers? Or had enough learning gone on in that first lockdown so that each individual school and each individual early learning setting knew what to do in any subsequent or in any further either lockdown or period of sickness which required blended learning. So this was a structure we came with. Observation I just want to make there is that people initially assumed that what you do is, and certainly we had that from public, media and politicians, that what you do is you transfer exactly what young people were doing in their primary school or their secondary school onto online. And of course, it doesn't work. A traditional timetable moving into an online space doesn't work in the same way. So that's what you see there. It was after several iterations, this is what we presented. We worked with the levels: early level, first level, second level, and the benefits from that and the dividends for that are still being understood. There were many benefits in the groupings of learners into that space. We had a lot of friendships developing online. Some youngsters were with eSchool for 3 days, some of them were with eSchool for 1 day, and some of them were with eSchool for a month, and some of them are still there because they were long-term shielders. Next slide, please. Some of the factors early on that we had to constantly take into account were and again, it's interesting that this came out this morning, people talking about triangles and three-legged stools, but these dynamics were really important, that as you're designing curriculum, and by that I mean the learning and teaching and the offer as it will be experienced by the learner, you have to interplay that with the technical capability you're working with. You might call that the digital infrastructure or whatever. There are many dynamics to that. But the important one I want everybody to pick out of here is the one on staffing. You can't do any of it unless you've got teachers and practitioners who are really willing to step into this space. And what they were doing here was exposing themselves fully. They might have been fabulous at pedagogy, learning and teaching in a traditional setting, but we're asking them to step in and be innovative in a very publicly exposed place. And I do want to just pause on that. That for me is one of the bits that we're still exploring about the journeys teachers went on. One of the findings, for instance, often is that younger teachers adapt more to digital than older teachers. And I need to be careful in my terminology there. But actually what we're finding is that as we reflect back, the teachers with lots of experience in pedagogy, they were good at learning and teaching, do an incredibly good job here if they are supported by teachers or colleagues who are much more comfortable with the technology. So there's something really interesting going on there. But I'm aware, for instance, that there are teachers from the NELO work in the audience today, and their contribution to what happened here was instrumental. Next slide, please. This is just to make most of you smile and to make me feel sick, because on a week-to-week basis, we had no idea what was coming up. So just imagine the scenario that we were constantly reading the news, constantly trawling the attendance figures, and we were meeting every single morning to say, where are we today? And, there were Monday mornings when we started off by saying there's been a request to have 200 children in tomorrow. And the 200 children might come from one school, they might come from 5 schools. So we could have a debate about that alone, what that throws up and what that helped us to learn. But these were the planning assumptions we had between August and Christmas of last year. So you could look at a conventional class group, and the only comment I want to make there on that slide is that's what public perception was, if we remember this a way back and we think about the arguments and debates that took place at the beginning of the pandemic. And these assumptions, people were so thrilled to the idea of one teacher with, 25, 30 children in front of them. And the only possible best solution was that all of that moved online. So that's why we call it a conventional class grouping. And we prayed all the way up to Christmas that we would never end up with a week where there were 1,000 children or over, because we had calculated up to that number. So on to the next, please. And just this is, there are many slides we could share here, but one of the things we kept having to do was constantly replan, and this is where the innovation was taking place, and we always found a solution. So initially the plan, as you see in the middle there, was for what we called short-term provisions. So we knew that when youngsters were sent home isolating in groups, they were out for between 3 to 10 days. And so the first plan was round about that, and we had very exciting programs developed there. But then what began to emerge was a pattern of youngsters who were joining because they were shielding, and that is then what's called the long-term provision. And we were working always with the young people who were there, and some of them became the greatest innovators about how the teachers were teaching, how the technology was being used, what the content was, and how we were planning it. And that was hugely exciting. So that all went on in the period up until Christmas. Next slide, please. And you have there for what eSchool will call the online school. And that is still there because we don't know, is there going to be a third wave? Is there still a need for it? As of today, for instance, there's about 20 young people using this who are still in the long-term shielding category. We anticipate that will stop at the end of this term. But again, it's ready. We've tested it. We know what works, and we know it works well. Next slide, please. And then you moved into January, and this is what we mean about predicting and coming up with solutions. And you remember we went into lockdown at that point. Yes, we went into lockdown. I'm just checking my slides here. I think I've gone the wrong way around. No, I'm fine. We went into lockdown at that point, and then we were looking at another permutation. What did we do when everybody was back at home again? And what you see here is the beginning of adaptations, plans that had already been made but hadn't ever had to be enacted, and they were being acted at speed. And again, the feedback there, the feedback flow was continuous. And that's the bit I think we're exploring now. What remains? Some of these things are accessible today. They'll be accessible when teachers come back in August, and they will be accessible in December. And there's been some really interesting learning in that for curriculum innovation and pedagogy in particular. Next slide, please. This is a really interesting one. I really would ask everybody to particularly notice this one. What became clear, eSchool had always had a really good partnership arrangement with a group of partners who would assist in feeding into the curriculum. What happened here was that because of our DYW team and Education Scotland coming together with that team in eSchool, we began to see partners like, for instance, Edinburgh Zoo or employer groups saying, we will refine part of our offer, which is usually predicated on youngsters coming into our, in the case of Edinburgh Zoo, our classroom, and we will amend our programs and adapt our programs so that we can do it in a different way. That period of innovation was fabulous. I haven't got the numbers directly in front of me, but we were talking about 40, 50 partners coming. And when I did my training to be on standby to teach in eSchool, I was being trained on the same day as Duke of Edinburgh colleagues were being trained. And I can't remember who, but a group of DYW coordinators were being trained. And that was hugely exciting. And so between January to March, in that period when youngsters were at home, something like 1,487 teachers had signed their classes up to take part in these programs. That's still running, and that will continue to run, and that's something we need to explore the potential of further. Next slide, please. And then some of you will have seen these. This is just, again, communication is key. I think Paul will say the exact same thing. It seems that we tell and we tell and we talk, and still you meet somebody who says, well, I've never heard about this. How come nobody's told me about this? That's a big debate, I think, for all of us. And that's just one permutation of some of the comms we were trying to do and to help people pick up what they needed. Next slide, please. So a little change of tack now, because when we've got all of that going on, that gives you a feel for some of what went on. Here's some of the learning that we're collating together and trying to understand what went on over this period through the lens of what's there, what presents itself for curriculum innovation. Now, I'm not going to read through all of these, but what I do want is to focus in for the next little bit on these two in blue. Really intriguing that I think we've shifted in our understanding, and by we I mean parents, communities, all of us have shifted in our understanding of what learning is, our need for connection, and well-being is part of that. So to make it clear, my understanding of well-being is absolutely connected to learning. It's not something that you go over here and you sort out the well-being of the person or the child, and then you deal with the learning. They must go hand in hand. One is an integral part of the other. And I think that was fascinating watching, what went on eSchool, watching teachers develop, watching myself develop, watching the youngsters respond and give us feedback, and the importance of that sense of community. So I'm going to just do the rest of my reflections for my remaining 5 minutes around these two. And the second one is children and young people's skills as independent learners. And that's been talked about a lot this morning. But I think we had a lot of assumptions. We had a lot of assumptions that youngsters, A, because they are tech savvy, and B, because we think we've done it really well, we're going to be pretty confident as independent learners. And I think that was challenged for a number of reasons, because so much feeds into that, like engagement, motivation, the need for connection, the need to be engaging with others. So if you just bear these two in mind, and we can look at the next slide, please. And just reminding us all that however we go forward, it's to do it in alignment with where we're going as a system. And just inviting everyone to kind of reflect back on what is now summarised in the refreshed narrative. But the one I'm going to look at in particular is the one that says there, Scotland's approach. And that is the why. What's our purpose? And we set these purposes out many years ago in what's called the capacities. You'll see a similar thing in Wales, but they call them the purposes. So we set out at that point what we were about with young people. And again, I just want to do a very quick next slide, please. I'm going to take you through 4 slides, which are deliberately provocative. And they start off with us, the adults in the room. We need to engage with what these attributes are. There's no point in looking at them on behalf of somebody else if we don't understand. So again, when we're looking to the innovation that's presented to us and the opportunities now, let's reflect back on what it means to be, for instance, me or you as an effective contributor. And these are just provocations. Next slide. What does it mean with exact same attributes? What does that mean and look like when I'm in the senior phase? And the next slide, please. And what does it mean when I'm in primary, going through the broad general education? Exact same attributes. And the next slide, please. And what does it mean when I'm just beginning all of this? So, and next slide, please. Really important that we can reflect on that direction of travel that we have set ourselves as a country. And these words become really important. These are the ones that introduce these 4 capacities or reintroduce them in that refreshed narrative. That whole thing about the first bullet point, the importance of relationships and families and communities, the second one about the skills and the attributes needed, and of course, enabling our youngsters to be democratic citizens. And in that we have to, deal with quite a number of things, and we maybe come back to that in the panel. And so, just to stimulate some thought, next slide, please. I'm choosing some images from some of our work across the National e-learning offer, in order in which we will come about them. So I'm a 3-year-old. Here's Doug, and I hope all of you have spotted Doug. Doug is not quite an avatar, using the language of this conference, but he's a mascot, and he has his own web space designed for the early years. He now has his own Twitter account. He is so popular, and as we speak today, he's travelling from one local authority to Aberdeenshire, I believe, where he'll spend the next week in a nursery in an early learning setting there. Designed to deal with a connection, but what's happening is it's creating a momentum in the early learning community round about how we do learning, how we work out in practice being. Sorry. Are we okay? Are we still hearing me? There's some kind of feedback. Yes, sorry. Next slide, please. In the primary, again, I just want to focus on a couple of things here to stimulate discussion. What's it like to be in primary? Would the likes of Doug work in primary? We don't think so. So what do we do? Next slide, please. There's been a lot of engagement of young people in primary with the learning spaces, with them responding and taking their own challenges back in, giving feedback when they were involved with this, either in the remote situation or back in classrooms being part of this and tuning in with their whole class. Next slide, please. One interesting thing which we've just developed since schools went back in just after Easter is the notion of Scotland's Assembly. Because, of course, head teachers were saying we can't bring our children together. That's still one of the restrictions. We can't bring them all together for an assembly whenever we do that on a weekly basis. And so we've introduced this concept of Scotland's Assembly. I hope you all know who that is. The first one happened to land on Jazz Day. And so the first introduction was live from Cathedral in Glasgow from Tommy Smith. Next slide. And you had youngsters participating from classrooms across the country. Is that another thing that we could do? Does that help in our innovation and pedagogy? And next slide, please. And then you will remember there was a decision where we all thought that for the whole month of March, S1 to S3 were going to be learning remotely, while the senior phase pupils went back into school. And so again, Paul will talk about this in more detail, but this was our first chance to really get the interplay between synchronous and asynchronous. And this model, I think, certainly was met with a lot of very positive feedback from head teachers who by then were back in school. If you remember the very quick decision, we had designed it for youngsters who were going to be at home, and then suddenly they were all back in school. But again, there's something really interesting in that model for us to develop. Next slide, please. And this, again, big questions. This was again targeted at the S1 to S3 group. What we're doing with this just now is we're seeing that as groups across the country, and I mean groups in local authorities and sometimes directly in schools, are developing their interdisciplinary learning, which was an area of great interest before COVID. These big questions are helping them to design and stimulate what they might do going forward. And I've just been warned that I've now gone over things. So I'm going to very quickly, Inka, the last couple of slides, just flip through them. This is just an images to look at, and on to the last one, another two, and I think I should stop there. That's fine. So way over my time, as usual. Paul, forgive me. I've taken up about 3 minutes of your time. So over to you now.
Thanks, Joan. And as you said earlier on, we've obviously been working on a daily basis, so I'm completely used to waiting a few extra minutes. So yeah, as Joan said, my name is Paul Downey. I'm a biology teacher and a faculty head of science at Hindland Secondary School in Glasgow. And I'm currently on secondment to the West Partnership Regional Improvement Collaborative, coordinating West to West. So this afternoon, I guess I really hope to be able to share my own experience in utilising technology to enhance learning and teaching, with a specific focus on how we've used asynchronous learning to support young people over the kind of past 18 months or so. And throughout it, I'll try and do my best Patrick Vallance impersonation. So with that in mind, can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So if you were to walk into any science department in Scotland, you're likely to find a starting science textbook similar to the one on the left-hand side of the screen. Let me firstly point out there's nothing wrong with that. They offer good resources for BGE learners. They introduce a variety of fundamental principles in science. And on the first page of that book, it clearly states that your science class is a place for doing experiments. And that's correct. It's a practical subject and it's brought to life through investigation, practical work, and positive relationships between ourselves as teachers and our learners. The book also rightly goes on to say, but your science class is also a place for reading books, which is also obviously true. Now, reading, research, literature studies, they're all a huge part of science. So that pretty much is, sounds about right so far. But what you also find in those introductory pages is the date of publication. Now, those textbooks are older than our learners using them today. They were written and printed for a world that looks very different to the one that our learners are currently growing up in. And our young people today have obviously now got instant access to music, movies, games, communication and information on a variety of devices, some of which, as we can see, they can fit into their pocket on a daily basis. And I guess at the time of those textbooks was something more akin to sci-fi than education. And that was something that struck me very early on in my own teaching career. And I guess set me on that path towards trying to find ways to make the curriculum more accessible to the young people in my class. And the big question for me at that point, and still to this day, is why shouldn't young people have the same access to the higher biology course, for instance, as they do to movies, games, and music? Next slide, please. Back in, I think it was 2016 anyway, I did present a seminar at the Scottish Learning Festival entitled Getting Smarter with Smartphones in Science. And I opened up that seminar from memory with the sentence, it's not about technology, it's about pedagogy. And that's where I really want to begin again today. The General Teaching Council for Scotland has obviously updated their own standards for registration this year, and they now clearly state that as a registered teacher, we're required to demonstrate a depth of knowledge and understanding of digital technologies to support learning and know how to embed digital technologies to enhance learning and teaching and meet the needs of every learner in our classes. During that SLF seminar back in 2016, at the time I talked about how we were using smartphones within the department to enhance the learning experience within science in a variety of ways. It included stop motion animation to teach mitosis. It included the use of video technology, including one which really stood the test of time. I guess despite my own mother's calls for it to be re-released as it was originally recorded back in their old kitchen, which has since been done up to the 1980s madness hit in our house. So the question that kind of grew from there, I guess, was, did we really get smarter with smartphones and science over the 5 years since that seminar? Next slide, please. We did, I think we did, but ultimately in Glasgow that's been on iPads rather than smartphones. In 2016, as part of that piece of research, 98% of the young people in our school had a smartphone, and we reckoned on average they were spending about 4.3 hours of their day on that device. They were claiming that they probably only had 2 teachers across all their subjects using the smartphone, and on average, and I guess the reality was that at the time that most people, did have a device, but not all of them did. And that was a big problem. Not all of them had access to the same apps. Not all of them were able to have the data to allow them to do what we were looking to do. And the reality was not all teachers and colleagues felt particularly comfortable in using pupil devices and lessons for a variety of reasons. Fast forward a few years, and in August 2019, certainly my local authority were forced to defend themselves in the media for the decision to provide teachers and young people with individual devices. And in January 2020, myself and colleagues in our own school were distributing iPads to all of our pupils. I'd be lying, I think, if I were to say that there were no initial concerns amongst colleagues about the rollout, but I think we were all still pretty confident at the time that the devices had the potential to enhance learning and teaching. We all, of course, know what happened in March 2020 when those devices became absolutely vital in continuing to deliver high quality learning and teaching. And certainly as a science faculty head, it made a huge difference. As a faculty, we'd already embraced the use of digital technology over a number of years, developing comprehensive systems and tools for all aspects of our work. And really, as a teacher, knowing that every student had access to the same tools made a big difference when it came to planning lessons, whether they be remote or in school. So having those same managed devices, was certainly something that was beneficial. I guess similar to what Stuart Clyde from Bertha Park High School said this morning, he certainly referred to one-to-one devices and having a culture of using digital technology before the pandemic, really, in the expert panel he spoke on this morning. And I think we were also in a strong position compared to most getting into that first lockdown, although it certainly was still a steep learning curve. And there were at that point real concerns from professional associations around the use of live lessons online, although there has been great work obviously and progress made in that space since then. And it certainly helped to drive engagement amongst other benefits when it comes to remote or blended learning models. Next slide, please. Not having that live face-to-face interaction was a real challenge personally. As I certainly like to tell stories within my classroom and find ways to make the learning more relevant and interesting to my own pupils. And it was really an attempt to try and solve that problem that I'd created the Higher Biology podcast. Now, those are recorded episodes featuring leading experts in specific areas of the course that can be freely accessed on any device and a range of platforms. And it very much quickly surpassed my own initial hopes of simply engaging my own class, and since been downloaded thousands of times across Scotland, the UK, while also been listened to in about 73 countries. So the podcast has been listened to primarily on mobile devices. And I guess, again, if we consider that wider world that young people are living in, they do have that instant access to download all of these things. And so it was really positive to see that being the case when the podcast began to grow. Next slide, please. It was that early work in the podcast that for me led to conversation with Jerry Lyons in Glasgow and other colleagues in the West Partnership about how we could develop asynchronous learning for young people across the wider curriculum. And we created West to West. Now, West to West is an online school created by teachers. It provides recorded learning experiences for children and young people across the 3 to 18 curriculum. We very much, I think, believe that all children and young people should be able to access high quality learning experiences regardless of the circumstances, and that's not just during lockdowns as we've seen in recent months. And believe that the principles of high quality learning and teaching should be reflected in those recorded learning experiences. Now, those asynchronous learning resources online, they basically allow greater flexibility for pace and path of learning. They remove time and place barriers for learners, allowing them to use those resources at a time that suits them and their family. And we now have an opportunity, obviously, to continue to develop that resource so that it becomes as normalised as providing a young person with summary notes as part of the homework or revision, amongst other uses. As our understanding and technical skills develop and we continue to enhance and build on that progress and explore how we can use these resources, hopefully we'll be able to also extend and enhance the curriculum for young people. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide. No. Oh, there we go. Sorry. Oh, seems to have frozen there. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, you can. Great. So yeah, I think certainly listening to my colleague Stephen Graham from eSchool this morning, he certainly referred to a three-legged stool, and Jones obviously mentioned it again this afternoon. So West West is very proud to be part of that national offer and work alongside colleagues at eSchool and Education Scotland to kind of complement the great work that's already been done by colleagues in schools across the country. It's very much been a collaborative teacher-led response to feedback from children, young people, their families, and from practitioners, and it is now cemented as the recorded element of that offer. All 32 local authorities in Scotland have got access to it. It allows every pupil and teacher in the country accessing a safe and secure learning platform, and the content within it's been added each day. I think we've currently got over 2,250 video lessons across both the BGE and senior phase created by teachers working here in Scotland. Now, if we next slide, please. Thank you. So in March, driven by the needs of learners and teachers at a time when schools were beginning to return and were very much on a blended model of learning, we created Sustainable Scotland alongside colleagues at eSchool and Keep Scotland Beautiful. And that was very much an example of how these video lessons can be linked in a thematic piece of work and interlinked with the live online lessons that were being made available. Now, that resource was presented as basically a simple hyperlinked PDF document, allowing pupils to click in different parts of the sheet and be directed straight to the particular resource. And that's now been developed further for different senior phase subjects to further support alternative certification model in recent weeks and months, with course overviews such as the example for higher biology on the screen just now. And those video lessons have also been developed to have additional learning resources sitting alongside them to provide a more learning rounded experience for young people. And go to the next slide, please. So again, another example of one of those overviews, and those senior phase course overviews really allow an additional on-ramp for young people to access video lessons and additional resources to support their learning. They allow learners an overview of dates of the live supported sessions online being offered by colleagues at eSchool, and a link directly to the sign-up page for those. As Joan mentioned just before I started, the comms has been an important element of all of this work, and I'm sure we all really agree that it's very much ongoing. With that in mind, I think to incorporate these different on-ramps really assists in reducing some of the barriers to learners and teachers in accessing WestOS and other elements of NELO, whether that's the WestOS resources pointing to live sessions from eSchool, or the learning spaces that Joan shared, incorporating and utilising WestOS resources. And that's been another example of how closely it's all worked together. Next slide, please. Usage, just a quick word on the usage of the platform. It's now in the hundreds of thousands, which I think, given the short space of time in which WestOS has evolved from an idea into a pragmatic solution available to all, has been fantastic. And we're obviously now looking to continue to build on that and raising awareness amongst colleagues and learners about how these resources can support learners now that face-to-face teaching is resumed. Recent feedback from teachers shows about 86% have found WestOS useful or very useful to pupils' learning, and it includes that part of that strength is that it's been created by teachers working in Scotland specifically for the Scottish curriculum. Within our own region here in the West Partnership, for example, you can see there on the screen, the vast majority of schools have engaged with the platform. And so it's now a case of starting to continue to build on that and moving forward and having a really positive legacy from the past or recent months. Next slide, please. Next slide. So I guess really just heading back to the Trustee Starting Science textbook that feels so familiar and comfortable. That isn't replaced. It still sits alongside all of these other resources and does so comfortably. So I think there is a growing range of technology, as we've heard throughout the day and from various people. WestOS as an example, Scholar, ClickView, Twig, YouTube, eSchool, BBC Bytes. Colleagues have mentioned earlier on today that it can sometimes possibly become confusing for teachers to understand how to take that and make the most of it. And I think that's the really crucial part of all of this. Referring back to those GTCS standards, it is something that as teachers, we need to continue to develop our understanding of how to use them to really engage and inspire the learners that sit in front of us as individuals, because they are all individuals. And the example I would give is, if you give the same shopping list to myself and Gordon Ramsay this afternoon, I can guarantee you he will make a more exciting dinner for you. But if you give us both the same digital learning tools and 20 young people, I suspect the outcome might be slightly different. Next slide, please. So I guess really that just leads me to I guess finish up by kind of saying, if we are truly to build a network learning system around a teaching profession with certification, the terms, the conditions, the support, the meaningful professional learning that enhances these digital competencies to support and improve learning and teaching, then we really have to accept that it requires time and sustained development and training, ongoing renewal of the devices, and the connectivity infrastructure that sits behind it all. We know already that education drives social mobility, diversity, economic growth and gender equality. So I would hope, and I'm sure that everyone is in agreement that that has to be a priority and a natural next step in securing a brighter future for young people. Because above all else, it's fine having the technology, but the young people really have to be at the heart of it, because it only works if it works for them. So I believe Keith, I think, is up next. And as a former graduate of Dundee University, it's always a pleasure to introduce someone from Dundee University. So I'll hand over to him.
Many thanks, Paul, and good afternoon, everybody. This presentation is a little bit different. You've heard a lot today from practitioners doing very powerful things in the field, but this one is going to be a little bit different. Thank you, Inka. So I'm Professor of Educational and Social Research at the University of Dundee, and what I'm presenting today is a systematic review of the research evidence on the effectiveness of online and blended learning from schools. Next slide. I want to credit my co-authors. Walter Douglas is an educational psychologist in private practice at the Kelvin Centre. Derek Robertson, who many of you may know, is senior lecturer at the University of Dundee and a specialist in matters digital and especially in educational games. And Nancy Ferguson is with North Lanarkshire Council, so she was our route to concrete reality. Next slide. Obviously, this examination of effectiveness is particularly relevant just at the moment, but of course, during the lockdowns, a lot of schools did have online learning going on rather than blended learning. But as we shall see, there are differences in the effectiveness of online and blended learning. Next slide. We set out to investigate online and blended learning, but we very quickly found that crowding into the picture came research about educational games and about computer-supported cooperative learning and about computer-assisted instruction. But it's worth saying that in each of these three cases, these things had largely been used within schools or within universities and colleges. But clearly they had the potential to be used outside of school, and therefore we felt obliged to include them in our review of effectiveness. Next slide. So how did we do this? Well, very briefly, we searched 8 different databases of research papers, and we then eliminated a number of studies. Studies that didn't relate to schools were eliminated. Those that were dated before 2000 were eliminated, although there might have been some quite good papers before 2000, but there was quite a lot of not very good papers before 2000. Papers not in English were eliminated, and sometimes you had the abstract in languages other than English and an abstract in English, but the paper that followed was not in English, so it took a bit of examination to remove those. And any papers without any evidence, without any data of any sort, were removed. And finally, duplicates were removed, because obviously if you search 8 different databases, you're going to get some duplicates. Although I have to say that by and large, the databases tended to produce largely different papers. So, you know, the moral is, if you're going to do a systematic review, you need to search a lot of databases. So what remained? Well, what remained was 1,355 studies that met these criteria from all over the world. There were 134 studies of online learning, 232 of blended learning, but this only comprised together 20% of what we studied. There was an enormous amount of information on computer-aided instruction, but this was mainly in schools rather than reaching out from schools. And educational games were also incredibly well researched. 26% of the studies looked at educational games, but in most cases, this was educational games used in schools. Next slide, Inka. What did we find? Well, the simple version is that digital technology, taking all of these 5 different categories of operation into consideration, was found to be more effective than traditional instruction in 85% of the studies. That surprised us. I mean, that was really a quite startling finding. 8% found it was the same, and only 3% found it worse. Now, you've got issues here about whether there is a bias in the research, whether journal editors are more likely to want to publish papers that have positive findings, but you can't account for a difference as large as that in terms just of publication bias. Next slide, Inka. What about blended versus online learning? Well, what we were finding was that blended learning was considerably more effective than online learning. So those operations where the children were at home for part of the day, in school for part of the day, were more effective than online learning where the children were at school all of the time. And the difference here was 83% to 74%. But both of these were still more effective than traditional instruction. Now, what do we mean by traditional instruction? Well, the usual construction of it is a situation where the teacher would be working with a whole class, where the teacher would be introducing some new information, would then be asking questions of various members of the class about it, might then arrange for some sort of activity which might involve some sort of group work or some sort of peer interaction, possibly involving some sort of writing task. So that's more or less the construction of traditional instruction. Next slide, Inka. What about the other conditions? Well, computer-aided instruction came out as the most effective. 91% of the studies showed that CAI was more effective than traditional instruction. And games and computer-supported collaborative learning came after blended learning. But of course, most of these had taken place in school. Next slide. Now, what sectors of the school population were most effective here? And again, this was a bit of a surprise to us. What we found was that primary education and early years and kindergarten education were the top. They were the best. They were both 87% better than traditional instruction. Secondary or high school came next with 80% better than traditional instruction. Primary and secondary together came next, which perhaps suggests that if you try and run a project which targets both primary and secondary schools at the same time, you run the risk of overstretching yourself and not really doing either terribly effectively. And lastly came middle schools. Why middle schools came out at the bottom of the list, I really don't have any idea, but that might be a blip that would be ironed out by doing this again in 5 years' time. Next slide. What about popularity of subjects? Which subjects did blended and online learning occur in most often? Well, the answer is most often in science and mathematics. And then after that came thinking, and that was kind of interesting because thinking isn't really in most national curriculums, curiously enough. So it's quite interesting to see that the number of programs based on critical thinking was high. And then came reading, which of course is crucially important as a means of accessing the rest of the curriculum. English as a foreign language, humanities, health, STEM, writing. So there were some studies on writing, there were some studies on arts and music, and some studies on foreign languages. Next slide. But did the popularity of subjects, the frequency of occurrence of papers about these subjects, actually match the effectiveness of the subjects as they appeared in the evidence? Not really is the answer. What we found was that English as a foreign language interventions were actually the most effective. Then writing, and then science, technology, engineering, mathematics, then thinking, then arts and music. And as you can see, science and reading came some way down that list. So the subjects that were most frequently studied were by no means those where the greatest evidence was there of effectiveness. Next slide. What about gender? Now, if you talk to some boys about computing, they might assert that, of course, boys are better at computing than girls, but in fact, that's something of an urban myth that boys like to subscribe to. Not that many papers that we looked at actually explored the issue of gender, but, 60, 70 of them did. And in many of these, males and females came out equal, but in quite a large number of cases, females did better than males, and males did better only in 6 studies, which was 9%. And so overall, females did better, which again was quite interesting and surprising and a debunking of the urban myth. Next slide. What kinds of studies showed high effectiveness? Well, one category we had was high-low studies, studies looking at children of particularly high ability or particularly low ability as conceived by the class teacher prior to the onset of online or blended learning. Now, in fact, these almost all were about low ability children rather than high ability children. And what we found was that these high-low studies, which were mainly low studies, showed better effectiveness than was average. In other words, children who are conceived normally by the class teacher as of being of low ability in the context of ordinary classroom work, once given access to a digital space, quite often show greater promise, their learning flourishes, and they're able to access more resources. So that was an encouraging finding, we felt. There was also an encouraging finding in relation to what we call socio-emotional functioning. Again, only 225 studies looked at socio-emotional functioning, and actually most of these focused on self-efficacy. So they looked mainly at self-confidence rather than any other aspect of socio-emotional functioning. But again, there was high effectiveness here. And those studies that looked for gains in self-confidence very often found them, and gains in self-confidence were highly related to performance in the task in question. We also found that second language learner studies, who were mainly learning English as a foreign language, did well. And we also found that countries which did not have English as their first language also did well. And we were particularly interested in looking at studies which were written in English but didn't come from English-speaking countries. Because, of course, a lot of the research, if you look at it casually, tends to be from the United States and the UK and Australia and Canada and New Zealand and so forth. But a lot of papers that were in English were actually more effective if they came from another country. Next slide. What showed a lower effectiveness? Well, that's perhaps a little harsh, because if we looked at studies that look particularly at special educational needs or disability, which numbered 89, we found that their effectiveness was a little bit below the average for all studies. But this wasn't actually all that much lower than the average for all students. But what it does mean is that if you use online and blended learning with these categories, then they're still going to be falling behind other students. So it doesn't appear to be a way of catching up for these students, even though it's a way for them to learn effectively and certainly better than traditional instruction. However, when you explore the special needs category a little bit more and divide it into subcategories of disability, what you find is that some categories did particularly well. Deaf and hard of hearing, attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, that might surprise you. Learning disability, autism spectrum disorder, and Down syndrome. Down syndrome studies showed 100% effectiveness in relation to traditional instruction. So there were some very interesting indices there. Next slide. What showed low effectiveness? Studies of gifted students, which were very few in number, but the results were not very exciting. Studies of psychological well-being, there were only 17 of those. But again, 79–80% more effective than traditional instruction. So we're not looking at something disastrous here. We're looking at something that's below the average. And likewise for disadvantaged students, again, 79%, not much lower than the average for all students. Ethnic minorities, 78%, not much lower than the average for all students. And indeed, all of these are pretty much on a par with the effectiveness for secondary or high schools. Next slide. So in terms of conclusions, blended learning is more effective than online learning, although both are effective but to different degrees. And in some cases, of course, online learning is the only option where you've got children who are very remote from schools. There is an issue for rural schools here in that they may be able to move to a situation where in blended learning they have the kids actually physically in school for only a couple of days, and then they're doing blended learning at home for the rest of it, and thereby reducing much of the burden on the children. Computer-assisted instruction was very effective, but much of it was in school. Games and CSCL were pretty effective, but again, much of them in school. Next slide. But of course, these results are based on pre-pandemic research studies. They're not a relation, they don't have much relationship to what schools managed to do in a scramble to try and deliver online and blended learning in a rush situation. Next slide. So the question now, as many people have already raised during the day, have we learned anything from the pandemic? Can blended learning be useful for the future, even if just for homework, or even if just to try and help students make up for time that they spent? And how will disadvantaged students fare? How will disadvantaged students who have problems of access to devices, to internet accessibility, and how will those students who have difficulty with self-discipline fare? Those students who are prone to procrastination, who think that they'll get round to it, but always later or on another day. Next slide. So if anybody wants to read the full report, which is quite weighty, I'll warn you, this is the location for it, and I'll put this URL in chat. Next slide. And we are looking to have this published in an academic journal, which I'm sure many of you will never read in a month of Sundays, but nonetheless, it's a way of speaking to different audiences. Next slide. And thank you very much for your attention. And if you wish to get in touch, do email me at that address there. Thanks again.
Many thanks to Joan, Paul, and to you, Keith. Again, huge amount of food for thought, and very interesting to get a research perspective on it. There's a lot of data there that I appreciate with post-pandemic, but lots of questions moving forward with remote and blended learning, which leads us perfectly on to our panel discussion, as well as our three speakers. We are also welcoming, and I have to apologise here for a mispronunciation of his surname. Michael Wilkinson is joining us for our panel. Michael is Managing Director of ClickView, who produce videos for primary, secondary and further education. So apologies, Michael, for that mispronunciation there, but welcome to all of our panelists.
Hi, everyone.
Okay, I'm going to start off with a question that, now this is a question that Derek Robertson has directed at Joan, but maybe others will be able to pitch in as well. Derek is asking Joan that we've invested millions in digital equipment and teacher development in the use of digital tools and spaces over the past 20 odd years now. Why do you think so many teachers weren't ready to use the digital in their practice when the pandemic hit? And why has it taken a pandemic to elevate the importance of the digital in teaching and learning?
Hi, Derek. Long time no see. I don't know. There's so many answers to that. I don't even know where to begin to answer it. All I can say is, in a strange kind of way, I'm kind of, this is a terrible thing to say, but I'm almost glad the pandemic hit, because I think what it does is it shifts us all. My slight worry at the moment, Derek, is that people's yearning to have some kind of normality leaves me with a slight question mark about, is there a danger that what people will actually do is to go back to where they were before pandemic and long before pandemic. Now, I hope and don't think that'll happen, because I think people have seen the benefits of it. I can't answer that, Derek, other than some of the practical things that when the tech doesn't work for you, if the tech dominates, you know what I mean, if it becomes too important and you can't do what you want to do or what you think you can do best in the interactive situation in a traditional classroom, then do you give up easier? I think why weren't people ready? I can't answer that. I really can't answer that. I think people had on an individual level hadn't themselves developed a degree of confidence. Now, I think there's other things playing into it. I don't think, Derek, you can just read it through the lens of using the technology. There's a lot else at play, you know, what teachers are used to being in their own classrooms, and then you're aware that you're using the technology in a much more exposed environment. And I think that's worthy of further discussion. You know, Paul mentioned there about the nervousness teachers had about, for instance, using cameras. And that kind of feeds back into some of Keith's definitions there. Youngsters do need, I think, the face-to-face. They need to see the person who's there, however limited, but they need that connection, as we're doing today. You know, is it more effective to see my face or to have my camera off when I'm talking? You know, there's just a human thing there. So I think that's been one of the blocks. And of course, there wasn't any crying need to use it in that situation pre-pandemic. But, you know, I'm ever an optimist, and I hope that what we've learned has been significant, and that we've moved, you know, in a completely different trajectory. So I hope we're in a different place now. But really happy to hear what Derek says about it.
Thanks, Joan. So here's a question from another one of our delegates regarding eSchool. They say that eSchool has been a great resource which their pupils have tapped into. However, it's difficult for teachers to really capitalise and build on the eSchool learning being undertaken because there's no access to the platform for staff. Can you clarify whether this will change?
Well, I don't quite know what they mean by that. There is access to the platforms. There's two things going on. One is obviously if there's a Glow classroom, if there's a setup for I think it would be good to get more specificity here if we kind of find out what the person is asking, because the three scenarios in a way with eSchool, it can be summarised as, number one, groups of youngsters who joined what we call the online school, and that was often mixes of youngsters coming together for 2 to 3, 4 days. Yes, so they were, you know, the timetable they were following and what they were doing in that space was very obviously available on the website. I don't know if that's what the person means. Maybe they mean the study support, which ran all the way through for senior phase from September through to the end of, well, it's just finished last week. Now, all of these were sitting in Glow, so that would be like sitting in a normal classroom. So I'm not sure if that's what the person's asking. So it'd be good to get clarity on that. And then some of the stuff that I was showing earlier on was very much on open platforms. So it's on the website, and the content is very easily accessible through that.
I would also add to that, Joan, that all the recorded content that's generated from colleagues at eSchool is also hosted on WestOS. So, you know, you have a fantastic open source website which has access to the learning spaces and various other materials from eSchool, and then any recorded material generated through the online sessions is also available to all teachers and all learners in Scotland on WestOS.
Okay, thanks for that, both. Here's a broader question to the panel regarding videos. What did you see as the main benefits of producing videos, and are there not enough out there already?
Well, can I begin the answer to that? People may say, oh, you can find anything on YouTube, and that's pretty much true, except that 90% of the stuff on YouTube is absolute rubbish. So there's an enormous task of selectivity that needs to go on there. And videos that are produced by teachers who are skilled in pedagogy are likely to be much more powerful and much more effective than any old video that's grabbed from the internet.
I would fully support what Keith said. And I think the feedback that we've had from teachers and learners supports that as well. As I said earlier, you know, one of the the big bits of feedback that we keep getting is that, you know, the video lessons are created by teachers working in Scotland for Scottish learners around the Scottish curriculum. You know, that there is absolutely, undoubtedly, a vast range of video content available to everyone on a variety of platforms on the internet. But as Keith said, there is a massive selection issue around that, and it's also not necessarily tailored for the needs of our young people. You know, we have a curriculum we can be proud of in Scotland. I think we should have the resources to support that.
Michael, do you want to come in on that one?
I think it's arguably quite difficult for me to answer that question, in the sense I wasn't the person producing the video for that purpose, and I assume what's been alluded to here is in the most part what's been produced for West OS. However, what I would say, and as a video provider into the sector, the content which we have always produced has been first and foremost designed to be used by a teacher in the classroom, whilst also having the capability to be used afterwards or before as flipped or mastery approaches. But where the videos have been produced for West OS, I think Scotland can be really proud of. They're a very different purpose of video, to be used very differently, and I would say quite complementary. But it did address something when a teacher is not present, because in that situation could not be present. And many of those scenarios will sustain well beyond lockdown in terms of the way good education can and does and will work in and across Scotland. Those videos form a really valuable part of an offer. And as Paul alluded to there, created by Scottish teachers for Scottish teachers, and in complement to a blend of different other resources which teachers will use to ensure the high standards of lessons that they'll demand for their students. I can really see why that initiative was created, and we've had a small part in that, which we're really proud of, and I can see how that will sustain well beyond this. So I don't think this is instead of anything else, but fulfills a very good purpose very, very well. And the other things which are available, be that video or other digital resources, are part of a blend of tools our educators should demand in order to be able to fulfill their needs to deliver an outstanding education, which all of them will want.
Thanks, Michael. So on the back of that then, what would you consider makes a good quality video for teaching and learning?
Well, it's a great question, and it sort of plays into that. So it's nuanced in so much. This is about appropriateness for purpose. So I can talk from the hilltop of ClickView. There's different sorts of video for teaching and learning. So one thing we do is broadcast TV. So it's amazing that you could take an excerpt of a film to create a stimulus to promote discussion in the classroom and use for that purpose. That's just broadcast, but maximising its potential under the ERA licence to be able to stimulate and create debate or extend learning or bring it into the real world. One purpose. You have another purpose in terms of instructional content. And I think, you know, even to the points we're talking around here, you've got the West OS type instructional content, an educator talking to students, going through key concepts. That's one particular way of doing it. The other way of doing it, again, for a different purpose, is where we are, which is that, I suppose, something a teacher would use to introduce a topic. As an example. So in that teaching and learning video, what becomes important are things like Mayer's 12 principles. And there's a lot of research which backs this sort of stuff up. Length. How long is that video? Research shows us after about 6 minutes, you've got the law of diminishing returns of pupil engagement. So you've got to look at the length of the video. And bearing in mind, we are in a short form world and how students of today are consuming other information. So you've got the length. Therefore, you've got to think about segmentation, explicit topics. So you've got a very targeted set of learning that an educator can go, bang, this is this, create the discussion, and it's the learning that happens as a result. So you've got to segment to keep that very, very tight because you've only got a small amount of time. So weeding out things like non-relevant information. But then it's important we get the visual engagement through graphics and multiple matching modalities. So the use of sound as well as visuals, on-screen cues, in order to get this matching set of modalities to help to really cement this cognitively for students in terms of their understanding. And then everything from pace and tone as part of that engagement. But fundamentally, it's about active learning. How do you turn it from a passive viewing experience to how the educator gives context, either through questioning to promote discussion, through built-in interactives, if the students on their own to get data about what students do or don't know to customize and tailor what happens. So that features to promote active learning, I'd say, are really, really important. But fundamentally, it's the educators that give that context. And I think the purpose of the video we create plays to that. The broadcast TV is a different purpose, but again, empowering educators with things to create stimulus or extend learning. And the West OS videos, again, within that mix, have a very clear part to play, because fundamentally it's pedagogy. It's experts in subject areas aligned to a particular curriculum, in this case, as a Scottish webinar here, talking about the Scottish curriculum for excellence, etc. So it's the pedagogy in it, but being very mindful of those principles to ensure it doesn't just have the pedagogy, but is going to engage and lead to better outcomes for young people whilst empowering educators.
Thanks.
I'm really reassured listening to Michael there, because Michael has run through basically the content from our training webinar that teachers watch before creating content on West OS. And to hear somebody like Michael, who has ClickView, who have created all these fabulous video content on a far more professional level than we as teachers necessarily have. I'm not Steven Spielberg. None of the teachers that have produced the videos are Steven Spielberg either. But it's grounded in those principles, such as Mayor's principles that Michael's referred to, and all of that. And we were lucky enough to have Derek Farrell from BBC Bitesize contribute towards that training webinar for teachers as well. And it's that collaborative approach. You've got Michael and ClickView being supportive, you've got BBC Bitesize and Derek being supportive. And I noticed in the chat that Jim said he wasn't sure if we're hearing of anything innovative. Do you know, I would come back and say actually one of the most innovative things is that all of this is one of the most powerful collaborative efforts that I've certainly seen in my teaching career. These are teachers who are not trained in production, creating content at a level that we've not seen before. Yeah, we've seen Bush Radio and schools on air. They started in Australia in the 1950s. There's no arguing that. That's great. If you look at the IPPO international scans of what's happened over the last 18 months, radio played a massive part in Zimbabwe and other countries around the world. But what we have done is we have seen how all of these different bits can come together and we can learn from them. We've not got the answer already. There's huge things that need to be done. There's massive training implications. There is infrastructure issues, all of that. But we're continuing to grow and develop. I find that hugely exciting. The collaboration between teachers across different parts of the country and the support that we've had from whether it's Education Scotland, whether it's Michael and his colleagues, or whether that's from the DVC and supporting us. These are everybody working together to support young people. That can only be a good thing.
Michael, you introduced a whole raft of pedagogical principles in what you just said. And I sort of wonder how many of those pedagogical principles do teachers think of when they're delivering an ordinary lesson in an ordinary classroom without the benefit of any digital technology at all? I suppose really what I'm suggesting is that in the context of your own videos, you've thought about the pedagogical principles rather more carefully than the average teacher in the average classroom.
I think if you're aiming for controversial, you're perhaps going to hit that. I would choose to say, I'm going to guess there's a mix, but I would have thought most teachers do understand classroom pedagogy and the use of resourcing to support their practice. And I'm sure there's always room for improvement in a vastly evolving landscape, particularly with the pace of evolution of that landscape we've seen in the last, let's say, 14, 15 months. But I would argue pedagogy is well understood by educators, by local authorities in the Scottish context, who are also supporting those schools and those educators. And I couldn't comment on teacher CPD, it's not my bag, but I know in the right hands, educators' hands, the sort of content we have complements and enhances practice. It reduces workload, and therefore, is going to support their well-being whilst they go through a period of time of evolution. But I'm confident in the classrooms I've ever observed, and I've been lucky enough to observe a lot in my life. Educators really know what they're doing with them kids. They really, really do. And the pedagogy I'm talking around there talks to how to empower them with great quality resources. I'm sure there's an argument for different CPD, but wow, what a pace of change. But I would controversially and respectfully sort of disagree and say, I believe we have world-class educators across all the UK. Scotland in this context, no different. And that pedagogy is there. We've just got to help them when it comes to different evolving landscapes and how what we do can help enhance their practice.
I would, as an initial teacher educator, Michael, I would fully support that as well. That pedagogy in all its forms, digital and traditional, underpins all of our courses, undergraduate and postgraduate. And I do have confidence in the pedagogical knowledge of our teachers that are going out there into schools. Right, I've got an interesting one here. Derek Robertson is back again. I really want to read this one out because it's something that I would really like to see as well happening. So Derek's saying, should maintaining a YouTube style video channel as part of learners' evidence be something Scottish pupils should be allowed to do? So many have this already outside of school. So imagine the rubric for successful creation of videos that children could come up with. This is part of their cultural domain. Do we need to be more open to this kind of thing? Do any of our panelists want to?
Well, can you hear me?
Hello?
Something seems to have happened to me. Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you, John.
Oh, can you hear me? It's just something's weird going on. I'm hearing myself back in my own ear, which is not a good idea. No, again, Derek, I am, as a parent of a fourth year and a fifth year, my answer to that non-professionally would be yes. But I think we need to look at many more ways. And I don't want to stray into this debate this afternoon. I want to keep my blood pressure in the same even keel it is at the moment. But I think we're going to have to look, aren't we, at assessment, not only at the S4 to S6 stage, but in the round again, I think. And gathering evidence in a variety of ways that are more helpful, more accessible for learners, it has got to be one of the main things we focus on. So,
I would just add to that certainly my experience over the last 5 years has been that's become a far easier thing to do since the introduction of one-to-one devices in Glasgow. Certainly within our own faculty, I know that colleagues captured evidence in a completely different way than we necessarily did 5 years ago, and we can store that easily, and so yeah, I think there are all sorts of discussions to be had around that.
Can I just add that in terms of the research evidence, we found a number of papers where children, young people were involved in creating videos and other materials, and that was found to be even more effective than if they were sat receiving videos that were created by teachers. So that was an interesting finding.
I feel like I'd be left out if I didn't say something there. Actually, I think what we're talking around there is, again, it comes to pedagogy, but around constructivism. And I'd even further extend, because where real, even further deeper learning can happen is in the realms of social constructivism, because we'll all create a video as a solution to our problem or whatever that, but the discussion that then happens as a result of that, that's where the richness really comes in what I would see both academically and in practice as well. Particularly happens a lot in expeditionary type learning settings, and we've seen some of the benefits there. So look, I think it's a wonderful aspiration, but again, like everything is part of a blend. What I would say, you wouldn't want to see that as the assessment end goal for everything, but as part of a blend, I think colleagues would all agree it's there's some wonderful power to have there to harness, to capture, and that's part of that evolving landscape as technology begins to facilitate that. But I'm going to use the word equity there. We need to ensure a level, and this is a global issue, I'm sure, equally. You'd have to ensure levels of parity and equitability in order to make that as effective as it can be, as not to further disadvantage. So ideologically, I'm sure everyone would be, wow, that's fab. But we need to tread carefully, I would suggest, in order to do so in a considered way to not further widen any potential gaps, and say that's a UK and actually a global challenge.
But an awful lot of children are involved in an awful lot of writing in school, and if only you're able to diversify the number of ways in which they can demonstrate creative products, you may actually release the capacity of some of those children who find writing rather difficult. That's not to say that they should stop doing writing, of course.
So on that note, and it's interesting that we do keep coming back, and quite rightly so, to the issue of equity. With regards to blended learning and looking to the future in terms of how we take this forward beyond into the new normal, how might pupils without easy access to devices or connectivity be served if blended learning does become a more prominent feature of future learning in our schools?
I mean, from my point of view, there are not just one but two issues here. One is the issue of children in disadvantaged homes who don't have devices or connectivity. And the other is the issue of children who are supposed to be doing blended or online learning at home, but whose parents perhaps are not there or not supervising them closely, and where those children don't really have the self-discipline to learn independently when separated from the supportive infrastructure of the classroom. In other words, children who are prone to procrastination or the manana effect, or whatever you might want to call it. Now, in both of those cases, my argument would be that access to online or blended learning in a situation outside of school should be regarded by the school as a privilege. And any pupils who are not able, by virtue of lack of devices or by virtue of lack of personal discipline, to take advantage of that are going to need to be brought into school to use the school computers, although not be in class, for the rest of the school day. Now, that might sound somewhat controversial, but clearly we need some sort of ways of managing this.
Would any of our other panelists like to come back at that?
Well, I was trying my best to provoke you all there.
Okay, let's think then, moving on to another issue that is at the forefront of Scottish education as a result of the pandemic, in so far as many children we're working at and schools are working at a deficit model. Thinking about blended learning, in what way might it be used to facilitate that bridging the gap in children's learning? How could it effectively be used?
Tracy, may I check? Is your question there around the lost learning? Is that the perspective you mean in terms of the gap? Okay, I think happy to talk, but I think Joan, I may have interrupted you, so I'm going to pass to my learned colleague in case she was about to speak.
Oh, well, I think she's probably treading very carefully, and I know what Keith was trying to provoke there. I think I'm obviously going to say what you expect me to say is I think we need to watch that term lost learning and labelling that goes on around that. So I think that needs to be said, which is negative and not particularly, I don't think, helpful for the youngsters who have gone through this past experience. I think they've learned different things. They may not have learned the things that we expected them to, but I think they have learned different things. So I think we are where we are, and I wouldn't like to think we were in a position where we were working with a deficit model where somehow or other we're trying to work out with some kind of measuring tape what has been lost and how we're going to then apply what we're calling blended learning, which again, we probably need to define that between us, but I'm taking that to be a mix of the access to what is called remote. In other words, I'm learning maybe on my own or I'm learning online with periods where I'm in school with my peers and my teachers. So I think the balance between these two probably needs to be worked out on an individual basis, and I don't think we can say there is one definite way of doing this. This is a difficulty. The fact is that schools and early learning settings are the people who are closest to the young people and how they're going to learn and how that's going to work. And my hope and belief now is that we've gone through a period where there's been a huge amount of learning about how does digital work, how can we work in these different situations which people hadn't experienced before, usually in their teaching careers. And I think people have far more solutions. They have ways of looking at it differently. So I'm very much hoping that what we have is now people, and when I use the word people, I talk about teachers plus the young people plus their parents, with a range of options which can be adapted and tapped into to meet individual needs. I think we know from the research who has been most affected, who have in a way, who will need most support, if we're assuming some form of normal re-engagement. And again, that's all open to discussion just now. But there's a whole lot of factors in all of this, and what I see are far more solutions to an issue that I think we all can sort between us. And Paul, I think it was mentioned earlier on, there's been an unprecedented level of joint learning and collaboration. And if you remember way back in my own slides, a far better understanding across communities, and by that I mean physical, geographical communities and parents, about what goes on in learning, what goes on in learning for individual youngsters. And whether you see that as a deficit model or as a positive model, we have a greater understanding. So I am the eternal optimist. I believe that we're in a really good place moving forward.
I would echo much of that. I have to say, about half an hour before the session started this afternoon, my head teacher sent me a photograph of two boys in our S6 who are having a kind of final day celebrations today in school. And obviously, being out in secondment, I wasn't around for it. Now, outside of the sort of science faculty, I take the football team, or I take one of the football teams, and I've taken this team from the moment they were in S1 right through to now in they're S6. Now, I have to say, for the last 12 months, we have gone unbeaten due to the pandemic for the first time in 6 years. I haven't said that, we haven't obviously played a game. But she sent me a photograph of these two lads, and what I see in that photograph are two boys that arrived in S1 and have worked incredibly hard over 6 years, and over the last 2 years have faced two of the most challenging years that any young person coming through our schools have faced, and certainly my memory. And in that photograph, I see two young men who are going on to college and university, who have worked incredibly hard over the last 2 years, have shown huge resilience, one of whom football's been a massive part inside and outside of school, and has had all of that taken away, but has still managed to work hard and do what's had to be done to get that place at a further education establishment and go on and continue to build their own dreams. So the idea of lost learning, I just simply doesn't sit comfortably with me. Those young people, don't deserve that term. They've worked incredibly hard, and I think we have to now take the positives and build and be better for them and for the young people that will come behind them. Because they're the future, they're the important ones. So the idea of lost learning doesn't necessarily sit fully comfortably either with me.
Good, but Paul, isn't there a need for a pandemically adapted assessment system? I mean, can we really have these children whose education has been disrupted for 2 years still assessed in the same old way despite their very different experiences? Or do we need, as I say, a pandemically adapted assessment system?
I suspect that's a whole different question, Keith.
Yeah,
Of course
can I jump in here, folks? I'm conscious of time here. An interesting question, and one perhaps for another time. Paul, thank you for that heartwarming and positive little anecdote there. I think as educators, we have to be eternal optimists for our own sake and for the sake of our children and our young people. I'd like to extend thanks to all of you for contributing to this session. I've personally taken a lot from it. Joan, your accounts of developing the Young Workforce Partnership really speaks to the theme throughout today of collaboration, effective communication. And Paul, it's not about the technology, it's about the pedagogy. Absolutely, and that has been echoed in the data that Keith has shared with us, and in Michael's passion for what he does. So thank you very much to all four of you.